Well, welcome to Plenary 3. My name is Tom Shantz. The topic of our session is the modeling of distributed systems. Over the last 2 decades, there's really been tremendous progress made in our ability to assess the seismic performance of individual buildings and bridges. But as most of you know, a lot of our civil infrastructure doesn't exist in isolation. What happens to its neighbor and the rest of a network really matters. And so if you're dealing with transportation, dealing with lifelines, utilities, communication systems, there we really are more concerned about the seismic assessment of the system as a whole. And that presents some challenges. Today we have 4 excellent speakers that are going to provide different perspectives on this topic of modeling distributed systems. Our first speaker is Bruce Johnson. Bruce is a senior project manager and structural engineer at Otak in Portland. Up until last year, Bruce served a 15-year stint as the state bridge engineer for the Oregon Department of Transportation. Bruce's talk is titled State DOT Seismic Resiliency Assessment Process and Mitigation Program. Bruce?
Thank you very much, Tom. I really appreciate being here at the Peer Annual Meeting. It's a great opportunity for me to hear a lot of things that lead me to wonder if I would have done some things differently in the last 15 years. I am going to talk about seismic resilience, planning, and bridge vulnerability. So I'm going to limit my discussion only to bridges, nothing about buildings here, and highway systems, to give you one data point in what one agency, a state DOT in Oregon, how they approach this whole issue of vulnerability studies and mitigation planning. The picture up there shows one of our historic coastal bridges, which is still very vulnerable to seismic damage. And I've shown some photographs of some reports that we have published over the last 15 years describing the condition of bridges in Oregon. So here's kind of an outline of my talk. I'm going to go through what I refer to as the 10 steps for resilience planning. I don't claim that these are the steps that every agency should follow for their assets. I'm presenting here something that worked very well for Oregon DOT over the last 15 years. You should assume that the work that I'm going to describe here was done with a low budget and low resources, and based on the information that we had at the time. As we went through these steps in the last 15 years, one of these steps kind of led to the next, and we kind of felt our way along. There was an excellent TRB conference in October of 2018 where they paid for 2 representatives from every state DOT to gather in Denver and talk about how they did resilience planning and studies. And a report from that listed some of these steps. Now I've added some steps that are specific to bridges and transportation systems, and I've expanded some of them, but that report is still a good reference from TRB. So I'm going to talk about assessing vulnerability, identifying damage states for bridges, validating design criteria, looking a little bit at risk, how to come up with estimated cost of mitigation, and how we identified our lifeline routes and priorities. Talk a little bit about the impact on rescue efforts and our statewide economy if we had a big event in Oregon. And kind of a new concept that we got ourselves into in Oregon, where we talked about a triage approach. And then the green step 10 is one that we're still dealing with and haven't really settled yet. So this shows the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. And the timeline at the top is over the last 10,000 years, and it shows what we believe are the major events that have happened, some 22, 24 events, half of them in the 8 to 9 magnitude range, and the others down in the southern margin, down around the 7 or 8 range. These have been identified and studied over the years, and primarily the last person who put some fine tuning on this was at Oregon State University, based on looking at silt deposits. So in Oregon, we are subjected to both crustal, interplate, and subduction zone earthquakes, but it turns out our crustal earthquakes have such a long recurrence interval that we haven't spent much time studying the impact of those. And our interplate, we have very frequent interplate earthquakes that are very low magnitude and don't result in damage. So in Oregon, and then as I said, this works for Oregon, we selected a 9.0 Cascadia subduction zone to base all of our resilience studies on. So our first step is we identified the damage states of all the bridges on our highway network. We did this with a computer program called REDARS, which has the highway network in it. It has fragility relationships. We used it because we could have the ability to input some of our own fragility relationships based on bridges that are in Oregon, that we've done some work at Portland State University to identify. And because we could take into account liquefaction, and we wanted to do that based on our sites in Oregon. Once we identified our damage states, one of the things we realized was that if we actually did have a major Cascadia subduction zone earthquake in Oregon, damage would be so widespread in Western Oregon that the typical life safety design criteria of AASHTO just wouldn't work for us. We needed a performance level for our bridges, at least those on our lifeline routes in Western Oregon. And so in 2004, we adopted a performance level criteria for our bridges. We started out using the 500-year event, but we transitioned to what we call a Cascadia Scenario, and this is the same basis that USGS uses in the probabilistic national hazard maps, only we deaggregated just the Cascadia subduction zone, and we designed to that. And we defined serviceability as being able to use the bridge within 72 hours. So we gave ourselves a chance to get out and inspect the bridge and look at minor cracking and those kind of things. And then if okay by an engineer, then we would open it up back to traffic. What that essentially means, a structural engineer would probably understand this, is that essentially bridges in Oregon on our lifeline routes now are designed to be essentially elastic under the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. So we believe that that's going to give us the level of performance that we need. We also, in the last 15 years, we sort of changed our approach. In the 15 years prior to that, we'd done a lot of analysis of our bridge conditions and what would happen to our system, but we kept all that internally. We used it to prioritize and make decisions, but we didn't really let the public know. Starting 15 years ago, we established a dashboard, and we published what the number of bridges and where they were, what the condition state would be. We made presentations where we showed slides like this, where we actually labeled the bridges with the proposed damage state. We had 5 damage states, from collapse to minor to no damage. And this really resonated with the public, and we started having a lot of understanding about what we felt was a really serious issue for the state and its economy. We published reports that described the conditions, and in these reports, we did something that at the time we felt was a little bit unique. Instead of just concentrating on bridges, we also did vulnerability studies of all of our landslides and rockfalls. In our coast range and in the Cascades, Oregon's pretty wet in the west, and depending on when an earthquake happens, a lot of our slides are designed for a pretty low safety factor, and if it's in the wet part of the year, and we start moving things around, we identified a large number of landslides that would occur and need to be mitigated if we were going to make our system resilient. The other thing we did with the public is we stopped talking about essential, critical, and normal bridges. With engineers, we still use those terms, but with the public, we just talk about our lifeline routes. And we prioritize them in 3 tiers. And we started an investment strategy. We identified basically the cost to retrofit bridges and mitigate landslides on a priority system. We estimated those costs and reported that not only to our Transportation Commission and the legislature, but also to the public, so they knew exactly what was going on. One of the things we wanted to do to communicate the seriousness of the issue that we felt in Oregon, because if you study the Cascadia Subduction Zone, you know the last earthquake there, the major damaging earthquake was in 1700, January. And we believe that the recurrence interval is somewhere around 300 to 500 years, going back looking at the silt data. And so we think that there's a chance, about a 35% relative probability in the next 50 years that we're going to have a damaging earthquake there. So we got a big computer program that takes 3 or 4 days to run, that we have our highway system in there and all of our economic generators. And we ran the computer program with the damage of the bridges that we had estimated. And then we found out what would happen to our economy. And we identified around Oregon, especially in Western Oregon, a number of these, and the dark colors indicate the more severity of isolation of these areas and these routes. And so we identified these islands of isolation that if we didn't do something in terms of retrofit and mitigating the landslides and making our system more resilient, that people would be cut off for a long time. And we don't have a very dense network of highways in some places in Oregon, so if we waited until an event happened, we wouldn't be able to work on all the bridges at the same time, even if we had the resources or funding. And so we would have to repair bridges and landslides sort of incrementally along the route. And we estimated up to 8 years it would take if we didn't start doing something to mitigate the damage. And then we showed, what if we did invest in retrofitting and making our system resilient, and we ran the program again, and we showed significant improvement in lesser areas of isolation and our highway system performance, where we could actually save up to $84 billion of our gross state product if we did the retrofitting, which comes out to about a 15-to-1 benefit based on the cost that we estimated for doing our retrofitting. That really resonated with our legislature and with our OTC, and it resulted in for Oregon, a landmark highway bill in 2017, which for the first time, and I know we're in California here right now, where over the last 25 years they've spent $14 billion retrofitting their highway system, and in Oregon we have never had dedicated funding for seismic, because we're a low seismicity state. And until we really learned all we know now about Cascadia Subduction Zone, it wasn't a high priority for our legislature. But in 2017, for the first time ever, the Highway Department was given dedicated funding for seismic resilience. And a lot of that was the result of the studies that we had done and publishing this information and making it public, so that we had lots of support for doing that. But, and that's the good news. The bad news is that even though we were successful in getting the first time ever seismic retrofit dedicated dollars for our highway system, it wasn't enough. And we took that information about what had been allocated and did some planning, and we weren't going to make progress very, very quickly. If we actually do have a Cascadia Subduction Zone in the next 50 years, at the level of investment Oregon's making right now, we're still not going to be prepared. So what did we do then? Because that's not a good message. So we developed this philosophy that we call triage strategy. And it's looking at the money that we have available and looking at our prioritization and then reducing the work. So if we've got twin bridges, we're only going to fix one of them. If we can jump off the freeway and go on a lower class highway and retrofit it for less money, then that's what we're going to do. So we studied that to see if that was a good approach. And the first place we studied it was in Southern Oregon, along I-5. And we basically jumped off of I-5 and used US 99 and some local routes, and it worked. In terms of funding, so we could have a usable, resilient route from Eugene to the California border for $35 million under the triage approach, which if we had done the original plan of retrofitting all the I-5 bridges, it would be $350 million. So the triage approach was good for us. It allows us some level of mobility, and I understand it's not the same as a freeway, but at least we'd be able to rescue and perhaps start recovery if we did that. We looked at local agencies, and the first one, the trial that we did was in Tillamook County, and again, basically the same thing. Jump off the state highway and use local routes. Bridges are smaller, less costly to retrofit and replace, and basically the triage approach is about 10%. Now, those are the first two trials. I don't know that all of the trials are going to work. We're systematically right now taking this discussion to each of the counties in Western Oregon, and we're getting them to work with us to develop these triage routes and identify the costs. And that's going to lead to yet another statewide report, we hope by the end of this year, where we're going to have a revised triage approach for resilience in Oregon with the estimated cost and identification of those routes. So the other thing we recognize is that with the triage approach, we really need to do this cross-asset coordination, especially with the other modes. And airports are a big deal for Oregon's resilience plan. It turns out that our Redmond Airport, I don't know if you know Central Oregon, it's up on the high desert. It's extremely resilient, and it is the identified area for, hopefully, outside resources to come into Oregon and help us. And from there, we would have fixed-wing aircraft we've identified 5 resilient airports in the valley, in Willamette Valley. And then from there, it would be helicopters to reach people for rescue and start the recovery process. So we've also coordinated with liquid fuel, water, wastewater, railroads, the ports, and they're at various stages of analyzing their system and identifying vulnerabilities so that we could work together to come up with an investment strategy, not only for highways, for bridges and landslides, but we believe the way to effectively increase resilience throughout our whole state is we need to wait for the other modes. Highways are ahead in Oregon, but the other modes are working on their vulnerability studies, estimating the cost to retrofit their systems. And we hope, and that's why this is green, this hasn't happened yet, but we think that it is an opportunity for us to improve the work that we've done on our highway system and work together with the other modes and the other asset categories so that we're making smart investments. So that if we fix the roads, we'll be able to get to a place where people can find shelter and supplies and water, wastewater, and liquid fuel. These are the big issues that we have to deal with. And the only way we think we can effectively do that is to work together. The TSA and Department of Homeland Security are currently working in Oregon on the RRAP program. I don't know if you know Regional Resiliency Assessment Program, but they're bringing all the assets together And we hope that through that process, we will accomplish that last item, number 10, and improve the effectiveness of our investment strategy. And with that, I learned a lot this morning, and I think I might have done this a little bit differently, but I really appreciate all the information that I've learned here, and I thank you for your attention.